Welcome back to Method Cooking. 'Tis the season for bone broth. It's going to start to get cold, and having this on hand and in the freezer is going to make making soups or just enjoying a cup really easy. So I've got some chicken backs and some chicken feet from Plum Creek Farms out of Berkshire, Nebraska. Hands down the best chicken in the Midwest. I haven't traveled the globe, so I can't say worldwide, but it would give them a run for their money. We're going to roast those off in the oven, combine them with some celery, carrots, and onions, a little bit of garlic, salt, peppercorns, some bay leaves, and some thyme. We're going to let that simmer low and slow for 36 to 48 hours, get everything strained off, and it's going to be delicious. With how long the vegetables are going to cook in the broth, we definitely don't need to be pretty, and we don't need to worry about peeling anything. So we're going to take all the vegetables and just do a really quick rough chop. Get them scooped up and just put them in a bowl, and then once everything's chopped up and ready, we'll head back to the pot. So just a really quick rough chop. Doesn't have to be pretty because this is just going to be flavor. Drop those in a bowl, and even when it comes to the onions, we're not going to worry about peeling them or taking the skin off. A little bit of that root in case there's some dirt trapped in there. Otherwise, leave the skins on, so as it roasts, it's going to carry a lot of that onion flavor over to the broth. So with the chickens, we're going to cut open the bag, and a lot of times, like I've talked about before, I'm going to have a raw hand and a clean hand. So only one hand is going to touch the actual raw chicken, so if I need to turn on water, grab a knife, open a drawer, I've still got this one clean hand. With the backs and the feet, we're going to spread them out. I like to roast the chicken before I put it into the pot with cold water, just because I think it brings out a lot more flavor and adds a new, just kind of like a depth to the broth that a lot of times you won't find in stores. So we'll get the backs spread out, follow behind that with some chicken feet. There's a lot of good flavor and a lot of gelatin in the feet. So as it cooks down, it's going to get thicker and thicker, and we'll have a nice rich flavor to it. Once these get spread out, I'm going to sprinkle it with just a little bit of salt with my clean hand. Get my hands washed, and then we're going to pop these into the oven, either like 450 or kind of a broil until you start to see some color on the outside. Don't worry about fully cooking the chicken because it's going to cook for about a day and a half, 2 days. I've got my first pan of chicken backs and feet roasted, and I got the second pan here. If you notice from these, I did buy them, like I said, from Plum Creek Farms. It's a local purveyor. It's a lot smaller of an operation, which means the chicken tastes a lot better, and also Dean is a stand-up guy. Once the chicken's on there, I've got about 10 to 12 pounds worth of feet and chicken backs going into the broth. That's going to cook down to 5 or 6 gallons of actually roasted chicken bone broth. The nice thing that I like about making my own rather than buying at the store is last time I checked, the USDA and FDA say that you can have 1 ounce of bone/meat per gallon of water and call it bone broth, whereas I'm closer to about a pound and a half per that same gallon of water. So it's going to be a lot more flavor and a lot more potent. First pan of chicken is roasted, so while we're roasting the second pan, I'm going to talk about this a little bit. Again, the roasting develops a lot of flavor, and for those of you kind of like turned off by the chicken feet, don't worry, like those and the vegetables and everything else is going to get strained off at the end, so you won't even know or like taste chicken feet at the end. Like I said, it's just going to add a lot of gelatin and a lot of body and volume to the broth. Stock pot has got a little bit of vegetable oil in it. I got that hot because I want to cook the vegetables just for a little bit to add a little bit more flavor and just kind of a quick saute before the broth gets started. The vegetables have been sauteing for probably 4 or 5 minutes now, so I'm going to come in with a nice big spoonful of chopped garlic. Add a little bit of a stir behind that. We're going to get in the chicken backs and the feet and any juice or I guess rendered chicken fat that came off in the pan as we were cooking them. Once we've got all the chicken bones in, we'll come in with a little bit of bay leaf, some black peppercorns, some fresh thyme. And then the last step is cold water. Always use cold water because it's going to result in a clearer and more delicious stock. We're not going to stir that up after it comes to a simmer, but we're going to get the water and get this pot topped off probably within a couple inches of the top. Bring it to a simmer, drop it to low, and let it run for a couple days. We've got 11 gallons of water, about 10 to 12 pounds of chicken, the vegetables and the seasonings all combined. We're going to let this come up to a simmer and let it ride for 36, 48 hours. We've had the chicken bone broth at a simmer for about 15 hours now. As you can see, it's starting to darken up and some colors start to develop. I'm going to top it with a little bit of cold water, and I'm going to keep adding that cold water over the next kind of day and a half or two, just to make sure there's enough water and it doesn't dry out. But you definitely don't want to stir it because that's going to result in a cloudy broth. We've had the broth running for about 15 hours now, just at a simmer. I'm not going to stir it as it continues, but I am going to add little bits of cold water every now and then just to make sure there's a nice level of water in the pot. Like I said, we're going to let this run for about a day and a half, 2 days, and that color is just going to get darker and more rich. The roasted chicken stock has got a little bit over 48 hours worth of simmer time on it. So now we're going to let it cool down just for a minute, strain it, and get ready to get it parked in the fridge. To help it all cool down faster, I'm going to put it into smaller bowls, just with smaller batches. I'm going to use a large measuring cup, or you could use a small stock pot, and then pour it through a strainer. What I'm using right now is actually called a chinois. It's a very expensive strainer, looking at about 80 to 100 bucks, unless you check out like a local restaurant supply store or find one at a restaurant auction. But it's a really fine mesh. If you don't have the fine mesh, cheesecloth works just as well. Just make sure that we strain off all the small impurities and little pieces of vegetable that are going to carry over. So a little bit at a time, we're going to strain the bone broth into a bowl. As you can see in the bowl, as everything strains through, there's no small pieces or little bits left over because they get strained off, but there is a healthy amount of both oil and chicken fat that floats to the top. It's amazing flavor, and it's going to carry over into whatever you cook or use it with, so I'd highly recommend leaving that in. With the broth completed, I got it all strained off, and I'm going to put it in small containers, label and date it so I can park it in the freezer and use it later on. With each container that I put in, I leave and make sure there's a little bit of fat on the top. That fat is going to create a barrier so air is not going to get down to the broth. It's going to make it last a lot longer, kind of create an airtight seal, a really natural one with that fat and oil, which is also going to be a lot of flavor. Just kind of food for thought. I've got 2 glasses here. One is the broth that I just made, and the other one is a store-bought broth. And even just a quick glance, you can see and probably assume that there's going to be a lot more flavor in the darker one that I made. To that, I'm going to keep some of the broth fresh. Some of it's going to go into the freezer. Some of it's going to hand out to friends and family. But as always, thanks for tuning in. Method Cooking. Follow, like, love it, subscribe it, and I'll see you next week.